All right, let's get started. Welcome to the panel on designing collective technology governance. My name is Asha Biega, and I'm a faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy, where I lead the interdisciplinary responsible computing group, and I will be your moderator today for this session. The dominant technology governance frameworks center on individuals. For example, frameworks such as notice and choice were designed around a model of a fully informed individual making autonomous decisions about their own data. And this model has always been a simplification, but today it is increasingly inadequate. And there are many reasons why. For one, the data that describes us is entangled with the data that describes others through machine learning models. And as a result, individual decisions that we make about our own data will impact others. For another reason, many harms that algorithmic systems produce, from discrimination to manipulation, don't just affect individuals. They are structural. Our panel today will grapple with the possibility that this gap between individualistic governance frameworks and the collective nature of contemporary technologies and their impacts cannot be addressed by simple band-aid fixes. Instead, this gap may signal that we need fundamentally different governance approaches. I am thrilled to be joined today by 4 amazing panelists who can engage this question from a variety of different positions: social science, computer science, regulatory practice, and civil society. Let me introduce our speakers. Jane Souter is a professor and director of the Dublin City University Institute for Media, Democracy and Society. She is a social scientist, and her present research is focused on the social, political, and communicative aspects of citizen participation, empowerment, and direct and participative democracy. She has a particular interest in the potential of deliberation and has worked on and researched a number of real-world assemblies in Ireland and internationally. And this includes We the Citizens and the Irish Constitutional Convention and Citizen Assembly. Christina Zenner is a senior advisor at the German Federal Data Protection Authority, focusing on topics related to technology and its social implications. Christina has a background in political science and political sociology. Previously, she has held positions at the Federal Office for Information Security, the Berlin School of Economics and Law, and she was part of a team of a member of the German Parliament. Nick Vincent is an assistant professor in computing science at Simon Fraser University. He studies content ecosystems and data supply chains that fuel data-dependent technologies like search engines, recommender systems, and generative AI. And the overarching goal of his research is to work towards highly capable and widely beneficial AI technologies that mitigate inequalities in wealth and power. And Six Silberman is a researcher studying regulation of algorithmic management at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the Oxford University, and is a consultant on digitalization with the International Trade Union Confederation. Six has previously worked for IG Metall, the largest trade union in Germany, and as a software engineer. Thank you all for joining us today. Collective governance can take many forms: data trust, citizen assemblies, collective bargaining, participatory audits, and so on. These are not the same. They differ in scope in who holds power, in what decisions they can govern. So let's start with mapping out the landscape of possibilities. I'm going to direct this question at all of you since you bring different perspectives. And the question is, what are the different forms collective governance can take? And what opportunities do they bring? Jane, I'd like to start with you.
Okay, well, I guess there's lots of different forms, but one of the main thing that we think about is in terms of collective governance of technology is that at the moment most things are individual. And of course, it's in the interests of the large companies to keep it individual. So individual consent and individual clicking agree for terms and conditions and so on. But what we really need to do is think about what's the collective impact on society. So if somebody clicks agree to wearing their wearable glasses and then they look at me, I haven't clicked agreed. Or if I click agree to features in a smart home where people's voices are being recorded, my kids haven't clicked agree, right? And there's a million other examples of that. So what we really need to do is have some collective baseline principles of what we actually mean. And from my perspective, consultation isn't the answer. That's kind of a tick box performative way. So what you need to do is really bring together people and all those affected to actually deliberate, listen to evidence, and to agree the principles. So for me, that's forms of citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, other forms of deliberative practice.
Christina, I'm curious about your thoughts on formats and opportunities from a regulatory standpoint.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this panel with this very interesting topic. So, our current regulatory framework relies heavily on privacy self-management mechanisms like individual consent, access, and erasure. And the underlying assumption is that individuals can fully control their digital footprint. But today's reality tells us a different story, as we all know. Risks are no longer isolated. Algorithmic discrimination, social profiling, and AI training models emerge from networks and from collective patterns. The risks are relational and structural, as Asha said before. And when your data inherently reveals information about your family, your neighbors, your co-workers, then individual consent, as much as we would like it to be otherwise, becomes to a certain extent to an illusion. And for data protection authorities, this creates a fundamental tension because we enforce laws building around the individual, yet the challenges we face are more and more collective and relational. This is where the idea of collective technology governance becomes relevant because it shifts our focus through promising new mechanisms. For example, data trusts and cooperatives, where independent stewards manage data rights on behalf of a community, or consent assemblies, giving marginalized groups a structural voice in technology deployment, or collective bargaining models allowing individuals to pool their rights to negotiate on equal footing with big tech platforms. And these approaches are most valuable for decisions involving deeply interdependent data, where individual choices fail to protect the group. To be clear, collective governance does not and cannot replace individual rights. It is a complementary lens that bridges the gap between individual-centric laws and a networked reality. And if we ignore this collective dimension, maybe our traditional tools will lose their edge. Some might ask provocatively, could collective governance eventually make supervisory authorities redundant? You can probably imagine that this is not my position, and I really don't think so. But it forces us to evolve, and that's the critical point. It forces us to evolve. And maybe our role must shift to auditing the collective frameworks more to protect the society as a whole. So one point perhaps in the existing legislation, there is already, that it already contains provisions that move in the direction. And for example, this is in the GDPR under Article 40 or 42. We already have there a blueprint for collective governance with certification or with codes of conduct, just as an example. And at its core, data protection privacy impact assessment, the DPIA, is nothing else than a collective tool for assessing risks on behalf of the general public. So let's keep this in mind for the following discussion. So the message is that as regulators, we can't afford not to consider alternative approaches and methods. And I think this one could be one.
Thanks, Christina. You hinted at a tension between the collective and the individual that we might dive in on later. Nick, you bring in experience with algorithmic collective action and the perspectives of users. Based on your experience, in what ways can we govern collectively?
Yeah, all right, test. Hey, again, thanks, really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm coming from a computer science department, so this is a little bit of a new experience for me, and I'm really excited to talk about these things with you folks afterwards. I guess in my first answer here, what I want to do is I want to speak on on the behalf of two subsets of the computing community to highlight kind of areas of technical progress that are opening up new things we can do. The first is this algorithmic collective action idea and sort of the related idea of data leverage. And the core pitch there actually is that as more and more companies are integrating data-dependent AI specifically, so these models that really rely on large upstream training sets, that the data itself becomes an additional lever to power that goes beyond sort of traditional, where it goes beyond but sometimes overlaps with just traditional labor power and also traditional political power, where you might go and ask your representative to regulate a company. So that's what the findings in this space suggest, and the idea here is that users really can just directly act via their data if they're mad at a company. So the simple pitch here is if YouTube has done something that is really frustrating and goes against the values of a large population of the users, everyone stops using their account for a week, or everyone goes and watches a really silly video, or everyone goes and manipulates their history. And this would really materially impact the weights and the sort of performance of that recommender system. You could also imagine doing that for all sorts of other models, for classifiers, for search engines, and for generative AI. So number one is just like, this is an idea. It's kind of started as a pipe dream, but I think there's an increasingly large subset of the computer science community who is interested in studying this as an interesting technical problem, but also building real tools to enable it. And so just part one, very excited. I think this is a real thing, and it basically is complementary to any other type of intervention, and it's especially complementary, and maybe we'll have some back and forth here in a second, complementary to labor leverage, where people are using their data to support, for instance, striking workers. So that's algorithmic collective action. I would also maybe make a connection here as well, which is that as more and more areas of work are getting integrated by being forced to use AI, or otherwise are sort of like seeing their entry into this pipeline of AI technologies, it basically, we're seeing a convergence where anyone who is using digital technology now is being forced into this weird pseudo-labor relationship with large technology companies, especially the large companies in America. And so we have the potential now for these new types of collective bargaining units where I might collectively bargain about my day-to-day working conditions, but I also would join another group that's going to specifically collectively bargain with, let's say, the traces that I generated from using a large language model or my other behavioral history. And I think this is, basically there's this real possibility that these are a new type of group that form. People have talked about it in data intermediary, data unions, data collectives, all these ideas. I think are, again, things that some folks in the computer science community have kind of written off for a while, and people are starting to accept that this might be real, and this is going to represent an actual source of power. So I'll leave it there for question number one, but I'm sure we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty here.
It's great to hear the computing community is catching up. Six, you bring in a rich trade union perspective. In your view, what opportunities are there for collective governance?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the workplace, and I'm just going to talk about collective data governance, not technology governance more broadly yet, and I'll talk specifically about workers pooling their data together. Sometimes this is called worker data trusts, and that's sort of a big name, and sometimes it deserves that name, but sometimes it's just workers emailing one person spreadsheets that they got from the controller. And then that person smashes all the spreadsheets together into one spreadsheet and does analysis on it. So probably a lot of people in this room know how this works, but just briefly, individual workers will file data subject access requests under Article 15 GDPR. They get back some data from the controller, probably as a zip file full of CSV files. They send those files to somebody, you know, it's probably Jake, Ruben's student at Oxford, who's doing a PhD on this and therefore has a lot of free labor time to devote to this. That person makes it one data set, spends a lot of time cleaning the data, and then they try to use the data to answer questions that the workers have, like, are different groups of workers being treated differently? So what kind of opportunities does this activity create? What good is it? I live in the UK. The most recent high-profile example of this strategy I'm aware of there was about Uber. There's a nonprofit in the UK called Workers Info Exchange. Many of you will probably have heard of it. A couple years ago, they did this. Around 250 drivers pooled data about 1.5 million trips. They were able to assess, I think it was just Jake, made a really big spreadsheet. And basically, they were able to find that since the introduction of so-called dynamic pricing, where basically Uber has a secret algorithm that decides how much a worker is going to get paid for a trip and how much you as a passenger are going to pay for a trip. And it's not like, here's the formula. They just kind of decide. Since this was introduced, Uber said, there was no negative impact on drivers' earnings, but actually their pay had fallen quite significantly, and Uber's cut had risen from a flat 20% to between 30 and 50%. So, the data trust, the Worker Info Exchange, basically issued this press release. They said, passengers pay higher prices, but drivers are not any better off. So they were able to really use this technique to pull together a data set and counter in the public debate the narrative that the company was advancing. And earlier this year, the UK's Trade Union Confederation, the TUC, called for a ban on dynamic pricing. So this was really the policy debate being affected by the ability to use this pooling of workers' data and doing quantitative analysis. So just 3 short legal notes on this. There was an earlier instance of this same strategy. It was reported on in 2022 here, I think probably in this room. There were 2 cases before the Amsterdam District Court in 2021. The workers were trying to get this data in the first place, and the platform lawyers said, no, we know what you're going to do with this data, and this is an abuse of your rights under GDPR. And the court said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing. The rights are there. The data subject does not have to justify their request for access to their data. That is not a thing. But in the omnibus proposal now, the commission is proposing to make it a thing. So they've understood that they don't like this. So they want to create a new possibility for there to be such a thing as the abuse of data subject access rights. So that's not great from my point of view. Optimistically, the Platform Work Directive in Article 9, Paragraph 6 is about portability, and it goes a step further than Article 20 GDPR, which establishes a right to portability in that context. And the Platform Work Directive creates a right to portability of all personal data generated through the performance of work. GDPR only provides portability for personal data that you as a data subject provide to the controller, that you directly input. So the Platform Work Directive kind of creates a broader scope for portability, and I think a broader legal possibility then to really use kind of data pooling in a bigger way. So it could be quite interesting.
Who would have thought that spreadsheets would be our first tool for collective governance? So far, we've been taking an optimistic perspective in this first round, but collective governance will surely bring about its own challenges. What are the risks and limitations that we should be aware of? And is there anything that we can do to already address them? Christina, what regulatory issues do you foresee?
So collective technology governance offers promising approaches. We heard about this now. But it also brings significant risks and limitations that we as data protection authorities must take serious, and everybody does. One fundamental challenge is accountability. When decisions are made collectively by assemblies, decentralized networks, or multi-stakeholder intermediaries, it can quickly become unclear who is responsible if something goes wrong. From a regulatory standpoint, this is critical because GDPR enforcement relies on identifiable legal entities. If the collective is not a legal person with assets under Article 83, sanctions lose their teeth and responsibility diffuses, making enforcement, something like a ghost chase. So another major risk is regulatory capture. Collective bodies such as industry consortia are easily dominated by the powerful tech giants. And this skews decisions forward commercial interests rather than public rights. Finally, there is a lack of explainability. This is an important point because opaque collective models can obscure how decisions are made, undermining trust and preventing individuals from challenging outcomes. So what safeguards do we need to ensure accountability? Perhaps I can say something for that and protect minority perspectives. So first we need co-regulatory frameworks that define clear legal responsibilities. Distributed decision-making still requires designated stewards or fiduciaries who legally answer to the regulators. We can draw inspiration from GDPR, codes of conduct, we heard this before, where industry sets standards and DPA retain the final veto. This is a possibility. Second, to ensure broad representation, we must institutionalize the inclusion of civil society and vulnerable groups. This means implementing formal veto rights or supermajority requirements so that minority perspectives cannot simply be outvoted by dominant commercial players. And third, there are technical measures. Just to throw one possibility, immutable audit logs, for example. They must complement these rules, ensuring collective decisions are traceable and verifiable. In short, collective governance has a lot of potential, but without safeguards, it risks creating diffuse responsibility and corporate capture. So to remain legitimate, regulators must demand legal accountability and structural equity for minorities, technical auditability as an important point. Collective approaches must strengthen individual rights, not dilute them.
Thank you for these concrete proposals. Jane, what issues, risks, limitations come to mind based on your experience with citizen assemblies?
Yeah, well, the first one is definitely what Christina was talking about, but actually what I meant to say in my first answer, but I forgot, was that I recommend you all Google the paper that Asia has co-authored on collective governance of data. So it's a really smart proposal. It kind of accords with some of the other papers in my area where people are looking at shareholder democracy and other ways of trying to move collective governance into areas of the private sector. But like definitely the biggest danger is capture. Like I'm sure there's a load of people in this room have sat in rooms and maybe they've been the person or maybe you've seen the person, but we all know the influence of the big players and you know the power is very asymmetric. And we understand, even with the watering down of the regulations, that's been the focus of a few of the sessions I've been at this conference, how that works on kind of multiple levels. And, you know, if you were going to have some sort of collective governance process, it's not enough just to have the process. You know, you need to be really clear about who's setting the questions and where they're going and who's actually in the room, which is kind of the second one about representation. Like collectively, who are actually going to be the people making that? How representative are they? Like sortition or something, so random selection, maybe a bit the way we do with juries and so on, that can help. But we know that for example, surveillance and things are very asymmetric. Some communities are much more surveilled than other communities. Some communities are much more impacted by the kind of the downside of a lot of the kind of move to grab data and to control the world that way than others. And we need to make sure that all of those communities are in the room. And the other thing is accountability. It's easy to have, for like the Belgians, for example, had a citizen jury on AI ahead of the presidency in 2024, and the principles went in about sort of it needs to be collective and human in the loop and so on. But in what way did the Belgian government actually take that on board? How is that actually happening now? You know, what is the actual mechanism through into regulations, into legislation? You know, we can agree guiding principles about the future of this, but what's actually going to happen? So we're going to need to be really clear about the accountability mechanisms. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you for pinpointing these key issues, and it will be interesting to compare how those manifest in individual versus collective governance.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't want to like override, like obviously the individual rights still matter. And, you know, the points about minorities are extremely important, but it's about setting a baseline for the collective and the individual rights build on that. You know, it's like rights to clean water and clean air. You know, you have those, and then that means an individual doesn't actually have a right to pollute our lakes and our rivers. So you have to have some collective baselines before you apply the individual rights.
Thank you. 6, would you like to add something on the risks based on your experience?
Yeah, I'll just sort of add something, basically saying similar things, but just from the workplace context, right? You know, working in trade unionism, anytime you stand up a representative body for a group of workers, which then has the task of representing to the employer what workers want, that's now going to be a contested locus of power and voice, right? So it's just, I think it's just so funny that, like, you know, I come from computer science and we're sitting there in computer science, like talking about like, how should collective data governance happen? What are the mechanisms? We're just reinventing political science without a clue about humans. So like, that's quite funny, but it's also kind of dark. Right, so, you know, to Jane's point about the mechanisms, right? Like, okay, well, these are big problems. They're just the same fundamental questions about like, how do groups govern themselves? There's always drama, you know, like, oh, the Works Council's election is coming up. Are you voting for this list or that list? Oh, you're voting for that list? Fuck you, I'm not gonna talk to you anymore. And you lose your friends, right? I mean, it's just governance. So I think, you know, the risk is that we think that this is gonna solve problems. It just changes the nature of the problem to another kind of problem that we're quite familiar with because we've been grappling with it for thousands of years, but like nobody would claim that we've solved the problem of governance. I'll just say one last thing, which is I think actually the word collective, and I think another word that we hear sometimes is community. These words can kind of blind us to be like, oh yes, it's the collective. Like it's all fucking kumbaya over there. Like they're all friends. Like, no, they're not all friends. They all hate each other. It's just that they hate Microsoft more. So on this issue, they're willing to like get their shit together. And like, yeah, that's fine. But like the word collective, I think, is almost like a risk in and of it, that because it obscures the difference.
On the first point you made, I think it's great to have spaces like this so that computer scientists can stop reinventing the wheel. Thank you. Seeing how there are so many opportunities and possible forms of collective governance, the next question has to be, what does it take to make these mechanisms work technically and institutionally? How do we design systems that support collective deliberation and translate collective decisions into actionable outcomes? Nick, you've engaged with a design of platforms that support collective action in the data space. What does functional socio-technical infrastructure for collective governance actually require?
Yeah, so I guess I'll speak to this first at sort of the design level. And I guess I'll note here that there is a community in computing as well. So especially around sort of online governance, online moderation, computer-supported cooperative work. And these folks generally have actually read some political science, which is great. And I think that there's not too much reinvention going on there. But there's always a little bit. I mean, we're quite bad on this front of reinventing stuff a lot. And in that space, oftentimes the goal is to figure out what are the minimal interactions or what are the best interactions that can transpose some idea from the realm of sort of political theorizing, right? So a particular mechanism or schema from voting, or a particular interaction pattern for having a dialogue or for having deliberation, and get that into an interface that people know how to use, right? So oftentimes what that looks like is building on top of online communities where people already are. So places like Reddit, places like Slack, looking at how people talk to each other on Wikipedia talk pages. I know there's some Wikimedia folks here. And it's a lot of kind of mapping between these interfaces that people already know how to use. And so my kind of just waving my hands across the literature in this space already, oftentimes it's not about a totally going back and reinventing a brand new modality and like having the most groundbreaking, mind-blowing new way for humans to interact with computers, but it's more about figuring out what's the really good stuff in these online communities that have worked for a while, and then can we take an idea from the political theorizing space and make it work there. So that's the technical front. So actually, I mean, I think one thing I'm quite excited about right now is that oftentimes iterating on these new interfaces is not technically challenging in the way that some computer scientists like to get really into, right? There's not an immense amount of database calls or really massive issues with latency and system interoperability and things like that. It's much more about, can you get the text entry box where people are gonna type in their opinion? Can you make it good? Can you make them like it? Can you make it so that when they type in their opinion, they're nice to each other? I mean, that's like quite hard, right? It's really, really hard. But it's a different set of challenges, and I think there's a lot of possibility now with kind of the advent of especially very quick iteration via so-called vibe coding. Lots of people can actually kind of directly iterate on this themselves, and so there's a lot of excitement in the space about like, we'll hand it off, we'll do this real serious co-creation with communities, being careful about that word, but like maybe even discrete, well-defined online communities who may not agree with each other, and we'll let them work on that. So I'll stop there on the technical side, but I think, yeah, I'm sure we'll have some more on this later.
So instead of just focusing on the technical, we really should take the socio part
I guess,
seriously in the socio-technical infrastructure.
My snappy answer would be that there is no technical element to this at all. It's almost entirely socio-technical, and that's because we've made so many. Moore's law helps us out here, and stuff that used to be really computationally intense 10 years ago, we can be a little sloppy now, and we can like use these crazy JavaScript frameworks that make your computer too hot, but it's okay because we have enough chips.
Great. Well, socio-technical infrastructure is one part of it. 6, how can we make collective governance frameworks work from an institutional and organizational perspective?
Sorry, I'm just going to time myself so I don't talk too long. I've thought really hard about different versions of this question that we've batted back and forth in various documents and attempts to govern ourselves as a panel. And I didn't come up with an answer to this version of it. But I've thought a lot, in our discussions yesterday and listening to the discussions in this conference today and yesterday, I've thought a lot about what can I usefully say about infrastructure and the sort of intersection of technical infrastructure and collective governance from my perspective as a trade unionist and as a researcher, but really first and foremost as a trade unionist. And I've came to the kind of point which I just stole from Susanna Bodker, one of the originators of human-computer interaction and participatory design especially. And my answer, I think, for us now is we have to build technical alternatives, right? So when I think about collective technology governance in the workplace, Justin, who I think is here, thanks for funding our many panels over the years, Justin. We had this workshop with Susanna Bodker, a very, very famous senior computer scientist who was involved in inventing the whole field of participatory design 3 years ago. And we were thinking, well, workplace GDPR compliance is so bad. And this is kind of one of the places in the union world where this question of collective technology governance comes from. How can we improve GDPR compliance, and how can we improve the extent to which workplace software systems respect the data protection and privacy rights of workers, and how can we sort of do that through these collective and participatory techniques. And so we invited this like very senior, very experienced computer scientist, participatory designer to come and tell us how we could use participatory design. And she said, well, when we were doing this in the Nordic countries in the 80s and 90s, we built technical alternatives from the ground up. We did not use software systems that were created by big companies because they did not allow us to do what we wanted to do. We would have these big workshops with the trade union and the workers, and they'd be like, well, it shouldn't do this, it should do that. And we would look at all the off-the-shelf options and be like, that's not possible. And they had a whole army of computer science PhD students probably, and they were like, okay, well, we'll just build it then. And that was what they did. And I think, you know, even 3 years ago, we were like, oh, like what, you know, even Volkswagen, the biggest companies with the strongest trade union presences in Europe, are not negotiating with Microsoft over how to change Microsoft Teams or Office to make it respect workers' data protection and privacy rights more. That is just not happening. And so I was stunned. I just sat there and I had, you know, Susanna Bodker staring me down over the Zoom, being like, you guys forgot the main part of how to do participatory design. You have to have the capability to build the things that you want. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was a bit embarrassing. So now we're all embarrassed together.
Well, it's great to see the complementarity of your answers. So both socio-technical and so the technical and socio-technical matter. Before I open the floor for audience questions, my final question is about legitimacy. Legitimacy for collective governance mechanisms must be established across multiple dimensions, legal foundations, accountability, procedural fairness, and others. So how can we get this right? What gaps, what tensions need to be addressed for collective governance to be widely accepted as legitimate? Jane, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think it has to like properly embody democratic principles. Like I really like some of the platforms that are out there. You know, they're definitely a beginning that's going. You know, there's a large number of them, but in many ways they kind of embody a very thin version of democracy. You know, so democracy is just about voting. You know, you're just going to decide how you vote, or just inputting an opinion, or maybe having a short debate with somebody else about an opinion, but most often not. So it's not really about kind of the fuller version of democracy that we all, or we largely, I hope, subscribe to in Europe. So there's an awful lot of work to be done to actually embody more democratic principles altogether. And I think that legitimacy has to come from that democratic governance. So it's about like real independence. It's about not using off-the-shelf solutions, as Six was saying. It's about the representation of who is in there. It's about the full transparency of what the process is. It's about the output afterwards, about where is it actually going to go, how is it going to be linked into decision making, into regulation, into all of these sort of things. Like right now, just down the road today, there's a citizens jury that the European Commission is running on resilience. So this is resilience in the face of kind of cybersecurity, somebody cutting the lines, or resilience in the face of war, like for food and water and so on, and what are the principles and how should Europe prepare. But there isn't one on, you know, what are the kind of democratic principles we want to apply to AI and to the kind of coming agentic age. How do we actually marry our democratic principles with this agentic world? How is it possible? And that's, I think, what we really need to think about.
Thank you. Christina, are there any legal frameworks that might support a shift from individual to collective decision-making that would give it legitimacy?
Yes, so I think the fundamental challenge is shifting from individual to collective governance without losing the individual. So that's the main point, to get legitimacy, which is central to any collective governance approach. And to achieve true legitimacy, the collective voice must act as an amplifier, and an amplifier of individual agency and not as a replacement. The group's will can never compromise fundamental individual rights, so I think collective voices must set the floor for protection, but not the ceiling. And this balance requires legal frameworks, as you said, Asha, that institutionalize, for example, fiduciary responsibility. We heard about this before. Those entrusted with managing collective data, the stewards of a system, must have a strict legal duty to prioritize individual rights over commercial interests. And we already see emergent frameworks for this, such as data cooperatives and data trusts under the Data Governance Act, as well as co-regulatory codes of conduct. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time that law explicitly recognizes data corporations and data intermediaries like in the DGA. So for supervisory authorities, our core mission remains unchanged, ensuring these frameworks protect the most vulnerable and prevent power asymmetry. From a technological standpoint, legitimacy depends on transparency and auditability. I said this before, I think it is an important point too, because for regulators, they provide the transparency required for effective oversight, allowing us to trace how collectives' decisions were reached. But, and this is perhaps interesting to the things you said before, however, we must be realistic. While technological auditability creates trust and clarity, it is not a silver bullet. A blockchain or an audit log can verify how a decision was documented, but it cannot guarantee that the underlying deliberation was fair or inclusive or democratic. So in some, legitimacy and collective technology governance emerges the intersection of social trust, legal accountability, and technical transparency. And I really think that it's a combination of these factors which is crucial. And by combining democratic deliberation frameworks like data cooperatives and auditable systems, we can ensure that collective governance strengthens rather than diminishes individual autonomy. The result should be governance that is both legally sound and legitimately trusted. So I think technology requires processes and structures, and vice versa, and that is perhaps a good binding between all those different backgrounds here on the panel.
It is encouraging to hear that we can both learn from the project of democracy and that we have some existing legal tools and perhaps an opportunity to develop new ones. I want to open up the floor for audience questions now, and as people, we already have some questions. So we have a mic that can be passed around the room. Please introduce yourself when you ask your question with your name and affiliation.
Hi, yes, I am Jeroen ter Stegge. I'm a data privacy lawyer from the Netherlands for 35 years. And I was listening to Mr. Silberman when he was describing his example of using your data access rights to use for the use of collective benefits. But it sounded to me a little bit like a workaround for something that is likely missing in the law. When citizens want something from the government, they use a freedom of information request. They don't use the GDPR, they use freedom of information law. So are you actually saying that there's a freedom of information law type of law missing in other sectors, like, for instance, employment? Because that would much more serve your interest than using some workaround in the GDPR. Because as a data protection lawyer, data protection is an individual right. It was never meant to be a collective right. So I would say use other types of laws.
Yeah, well, I would love it if you would help your government to implement the Platform Work Directive, because that's what's happening now, and that is creating transparency obligations on the part of the digital labor platform. And so, yes, the short answer is yes, absolutely. But the problem is political, right? This is a hard fight, and employers, traditional employers, but especially sort of newer technologically enabled employers and digital labor platforms that claim that they're definitely not employers, don't want to answer these questions, don't want to provide this information, because for them it's a matter of power, it's a matter of control, right? If the state, has a system of laws which it uses to control certain populations in ways that are convenient for the state, then somebody comes and tries to use freedom of information, they're going to redact that information, and that's what these companies do right now, and they're getting away with it. So this is what workers are doing right now. The platforms fought that as well, and are now using their political leverage to try to close even that workaround. So I think we're in a difficult moment politically, and that's manifesting itself in the way that these changes to the existing laws are being proposed. But absolutely, that's the direction I would love to go in.
We have a question here at the front.
Hello. Hi, my name's Dave Lewis from Trinity College Dublin. Thank you for the panel. It's been really fascinating. I take the point, we're trying to use some rights from data protection to try and gain more leverage collectively, and I think that's very admirable. It's, but there seems to be part of perhaps a broader problem. You could almost argue, we're seeking, no datafication without representation. There's lots of places where our data is being consumed and used in AI algorithms. And I think, is there a challenge there then in deciding who are we trying to represent in a particular situation? Because I think data has a sort of a time persistence to it. So your data as an Uber driver, or your data as a university student, or as a patient in a hospital, stays with that organization and could be used and leveraged long after you've gone. So when you're looking for representative with the current set of gig workers or patients in a hospital or students at university, you're perhaps not representing all the people who've contributed their data over time. So does that feature in any of the discussions or research in this area, how you deal with those transient data providing parts of the community?
I have some thoughts on this. This is a great question, and actually this is, I think that in the story of the data value estimation research actually is optimistic, or it gives us some positive things to think about on this front. And specifically, to keep it short, there's a lot of the literature in the space, especially like the work that I do, that's trying to estimate how effective would a given piece of collective, if a given group is doing collective action, how good is it going to be? How much is it going to hurt the algorithm? How much accuracy is going to go down? How much will loss go up? That work is like fundamentally about trying to assign scores to data units and say, this unit of data is worth this many points, this is worth this many points. And when you look at that work, what you see actually is that there is sort of this, a lot of the concerns that folks in the kind of like fair computing community have been yelling out for a long time around representation and highlighting all these ways in which the technology industry has just like underrepresented, misrepresented all sorts of groups, over the last, all the years. When you do this technical data value estimation, the missing data generally has the highest value, right, relative to some objective. And so there's some sense in which actually being missing potentially gives that group, while it's missing, that group has more leverage, right? That's the group that's most effective at changing the model weights. And so like right now, if we all wanted to get together and do a data strike to try to make large language models forget basic English grammar, it would be so hard. We can't do it. We don't have enough people here, right? We need to get everyone together to delete all their social media posts from all the history of any English text that's on the internet. What if we wanted to get together and try to make a search engine get a fact wrong about a place out in this exact street right now? We could most likely do it. So, sorry, long story short is just that like, I think this is a really big concern. I think all the concerns that folks in the fair and the sort of ethical computing space have been raising for a long time, they're still extremely valid. But there's this nice little inversion where the missing data actually has more value and has more leverage, and I think we should lean into that as much as we can.
Would Anybody like to dive deeper in this question of representation? Whom are we actually representing?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Priyanka and I work for TikTok. I was just interested to know that what do you think about, oh wow, everyone is looking at me. In like big platforms like TikTok, I feel like harms are experienced very differently across communities, right? So I also come from Bangladesh and I have a very nuanced sort of experience to share, I suppose. So, for example, when harms are experienced differently for different communities, how do we make sure that if we move towards collective governance, the vulnerable communities / the marginalized communities, their voices are not being drowned out by the majority expectations or claims?
Yeah, so I think that that's super important. That one of the core principles is of inclusion and all those affected being in the room, and so people aren't drowned out. So that's a matter of kind of representation, like who's actually in the room, which I don't know if it goes to kind of Dave's question on representation as well. Like it's about the kind of the principles that can be put down about this. And we all know that things are very asymmetric. I've colleagues doing research on disinformation in minority languages. And that's actually an even greater problem than disinformation in English in some contexts, because there's so much less of it and there's fewer people doing research into it and so on. And then people with less power, obviously. So it's about the representation and about how we actually go out and make sure that those voices are in the room and that they get to set the principles on which we decide things. And that's actually very tricky. Like it's really tricky to think like who are all those involved. There's people working at the moment on a global climate assembly. And obviously the impacts of climate are very different in the global south and in the north and even across the south and across the north. And, how do you do it? So it's a matter of coming up with the principles, with the redistribution. But the important thing is that you not only hear the voices, but that you measure that those voices actually were involved in the impact and in the outcomes, in the narrative at the end. It's not just a matter of having them in as a matter of input, because that can often happen, that there's kind of tokenistic involvement of different communities and of different people, but in fact what they have to say doesn't matter in the final outcomes. So it's a big challenge. And it's a big challenge for children. Children aren't involved in many of these things a lot of the time. The Irish Parliament last week came out with quite a radical suggestion that recommender algorithms from TikTok, for example, should be turned off by default for all children under 18. But we haven't had a way to get children's voices into this. So yeah, it's complex.
I just spoke though, so I think I mean,
this was a sort of a thought that I had in the kind of regulatory context, and maybe connects a bit more to the question or the topic earlier about legitimacy as well, which is like, if we're thinking about GDPR and jurisdictions in which there are similar data protection frameworks, a representative body is also going to be a controller. So that creates a sort of baseline of accountability. That's just like, okay, well, you also, right, in the trade union context, the Works Council or the trade union is also a data controller. And so if I'm, running the database of trade union members and I, piss somebody off, then they have all the GDPR rights to like throw at me and be like, hey, delete my data, I'm not paying my dues anymore, and you have to delete everything, and I'm not going to cooperate with you anymore. That's their right as a data subject, and that's correct. That's how it should be. So I think, the first thing that we just need to recognize is that any sort of collective representative body is a power to be held accountable by every other mechanism that we're always using to hold powerful entities accountable. One other sort of brief note from the trade union universe. I worked for 5 years for a trade union in Germany, and the way that they do it is, it's the metalworkers union, the auto industry, manufacturing union, and they're quite aware that historically this is a very white, male, German industry, right? So what did they do when they realized that this was a problem? They said, okay, they're going to have overweighted representation. So if you're a female member of the union, if you're a youth member, a member of the union below a certain age, right? Because it was overrepresented older workers as well. If you're a worker with a migrant background, then you have a special status in the decision-making process where you can submit proposals for changes to the Constitution that have to be heard in a particular way. It's kind of like the quota system, right? People don't like quotas. Germans love quotas, apparently. This is a basic, it's the quota idea is sort of there. Where basically it's like, okay, if this is a proposal that this group internally, through its own formal structures, has deliberated on and advanced as that group into the trade union structure, it has to be heard. It can't be ignored. Was it perfect? No, of course not. Was it not a bad idea? Yeah.
Can I jump in on this one still? Anyone else dying to ask a question? Okay. I just wanted to throw one more idea into the mix that I think would be of general interest to the crowd here, which is that I think I would actually say, to this point, TikTok is doing a really great job of specifically doing this for really diverse preferences over content, right? And I think, like, speaking in very broad strokes, the way a computer scientist might describe what's happened over the last 10 years is simply scaling up models a lot in terms of their number of parameters. So if we want to think about either a large language model or a recommender system as like a big matrix, there's a big bunch of numbers, right? And those numbers sort of represent what kind of stuff I want to watch and what kind of stuff you want to watch. And every time we feed in a single observation, we're all kind of collectively voting to just nudge those numbers a tiny little bit. And this is, like, again, in very broad strokes, how both recommender systems and generative AI mostly work, with a bunch of nuances. And so basically, even with taking no other action, there's already a sense of collective governance going on when the company decided to use that kind of technology. And so a reason that people really love TikTok and say that it's really good is because they'll say, well, it really figured out this, like, very nuanced set. Like, I really like skateboarding videos that have polar bears and, like, people are drinking coffee in them and just, like, very odd nuanced things. And they'll say, 5 years ago, YouTube never did that, but TikTok figured it out when I only watched 10 videos. That's crazy. And one reason for this is just that the models are getting bigger. You add more parameters, you have more, when you have a small number of numbers, a small number of these weights in your little spreadsheet or your table, if you want to imagine it like that, right? That forces you at, like, a technical level to do this majority vote. If as you scale it up and up and up and up, and you have 1,000 parameters, million parameters, billion parameters, trillion parameters, you actually have the capacity in, like, a technical information theory sense to not do that majority voting anymore. And so this is like maybe a weird inversion, is that the current trends in the industry that are driving a lot of bad stuff, a lot of centralization, all these concerns with sort of like local issues with data centers and stuff, the actual technical turn of using these really big models is potentially quite good from the perspective that we can really embed all of these really fine-grained nuanced perspectives. So I think that's exciting, and we should, like, also take that into consideration. That being said, another option is to have a world of many small localized models, and we do that instead. And going back to the previous panel, people were talking about small AI. I think you can do that, and you can actually get very similar outcomes as well. So there's a lot of cases where I'm not saying we should, like, run everything through a trillion parameter model, but there's some cases where we should.
I would like to pick up on this question, on this thread of scale, but apply it more broadly to the question of collective governance. Jane, I know you've been working on a project for scaling up citizen assemblies and deliberation. There is the question of what kinds of decisions can we apply collective governance to? There are, of course, the big policy questions, but is this a feasible model for finer grained decisions when a company wants to decide if they want to implement a new functionality or add a new feature to the model? Can we deal with these kinds of granular questions at scale?
No, I don't think that that's either possible or desirable. But I think what we can have are agreed societal or collective principles. So especially for things that are value-laden, things that are societally consequential, the basic principles. So I think we can agree those and then say that small changes that still abide by those larger principles, then, we're not going to be looking for, collective decision-making for every upgrade. But, like I bought a new iPhone, I turned off every AI feature to see what would happen and to save my memory. And then the next update, they were all back on again. And, I hadn't, I'd gone to a lot of effort. It took me, the best part of an hour to make sure that every single AI feature was off on my iPhone. And within one upgrade, all of those decisions were just negated. So that wasn't abiding by the principle of what I had agreed in the beginning. So I think that that's the important thing, that you can't just have these updates with numerous things and people who are time poor, people who don't have the capacity to go through it all at that moment, and you click agree, and then all of a sudden, all of your previous decisions are completely undone. That's against the kind of any sort of principles-based regulation, I would have thought. And then just very briefly to go back to what Nick was saying about trillion parameter models and having really specific things on TikTok. Like, it might be grand if all your kid is doing is watching polar bears on skateboards doing something else, but it might not be so fine if what they're doing is consuming eating disorder content or manosphere content or all of these other things, which is why this kind of like ultra personalization of these things for kids and the infinite scroll is really problematic. Like, they should, for our TikTok friend at the back of the room, I'd appeal for limits to infinite scroll on TikTok.
Can I go on the record and say that I'm really excited about this, the Irish intervention that's going on here? So I don't sound like I'm too much of an infinite scroll booster for my last answer. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Boris Stakowski from the European Research Council. I have a question. If you can try to explain to me, do companies already incorporate some form of collective governance when doing user research and usability and getting feedback from users? And if so, where does that stop? And what is not considered a collective governance when it comes to incorporating user preferences? So I don't know if you have some points on that.
Okay, yeah, lots of thoughts on this. So I guess, yeah, I did spend some time in industry as a PhD student doing research internships. I worked for a while as well, so I'm, my hands aren't clean in many senses. And I mean, the short answer is yes. And I actually do think that there's like a interesting theoretical argument to be had, which is that if you actually solve all the other injustices in the world first, let's just, academics waving their magic wands saying, let's solve all of our injustices. If we all got together and we made material progress on just general research, resource allocation, the allocation of time, the allocation of power, right? And then you have companies, you have the technology companies that are optimizing over your user preferences, and now resources are distributed amongst all the social dimensions that we might be interested in, then that would force the companies would basically have to go out and they would have to do user research on more people, because more people have money distributed more widely. They would have to do a larger overall amount of user research, right? The user research headcount would go up. They would do all these things. And then you would actually have an outcome that would look very similar to if we did the kind of interventions that we're talking about here, if we took more of a regulatory approach. Of course, that requires waving the magic wand. But I think that's worth keeping in mind, that just like as we fix other problems, I think it is true that like the user research departments in the company they do have aligned incentives with like doing so-called collective governance. And that's like a good thing. We should try to empower them. And like that's, I guess, a thing that I think about a lot in the computer science world where there's like a lot of revolving door relationships. People have written lots of papers about how the kind of interdependencies, right, in terms of funding and job opportunities and pressure, it creates a lot of problems. It also is an opportunity to push on that more, try to get that more powerful. So my short answer is yes. The reason it's not working right now is actually mostly other problems in the world, and not necessarily because the tech companies aren't like doing enough user research or they're doing bad user research or anything like that. It's just that like the people that they want to do the most user research on are not representative of the world.
Can I come in? So I don't know what the tech companies do, but what I do know is that they're attention companies. So what they want to do is get your attention for the most amount of time and then sell you things through ads. So they're advertising companies. So I can only imagine the user research is about how do we actually get you to spend more time on our platform, not about how do we actually embed democratic values into it, or how do we properly safeguard children, or how do we do any of those things. So personally, I wouldn't be optimistic that the user research departments are likely to be the answer. I think it has to be bodies outside of the companies themselves. I think we know that self-regulation didn't work.
I'll just also briefly add that if we keep the, there's a trend right now where with generative AI, again, lots of bad things, but people are paying for information in a way that actually changes the incentives materially for the OpenAIs and Anthropics, who are not necessarily, well, they might turn into attention companies, and there's all these concerns about sycophancy and trying to like get people kind of addicted to chatbots. That's certainly happening. For a lot of the users, the incentives are not about attention, but that's quickly shifting, right? There's now a move to push ads back into the chatbots. More people are going to do that. These tools are going to be deployed alongside other kind of like the long-standing pillars of the attention economy. So I'm certainly not holding my breath, and I try to maintain a lot of optimism about these things where everyone else is reasonably quite pessimistic. If we maintain the fact that people are actually paying for information or are acting as sort of like informed, empowered consumers, then we can maybe bypass some of those attention economy issues, but it's really likely that we'll just see a reprise of the past 10 years of attention economy issues. So yeah, I agree.
Thank you. My name is Clarissa Valibitov. I'm a senior researcher at University of Lausanne, Switzerland. And first of all, thank you for the discussion here. It has been very, very interesting. I like to ask the panel maybe an exercise of imagination. It has been mentioned the difficulty of using over-the-shelf products and how to make sure they are aligned with internal policies and the wishes of the users. So I was thinking about how then the AI availability could also be a way of dealing with this problem. What I mean is how we can use AI to build products that are more fitted to our needs and to our standards and values. So, for example, if I think about my university, which it has been using Copilot for everything, how can we make Copilot more aligned with our own values as researchers? Or if you can build something else with the help of AI that is more aligned with our values as a public research and education institution. Thank you.
Well, as a computer scientist, I think very operationally. So when I hear your question, I think how do we translate our decisions into concrete technical design? So even if we decide as a community, for example, academic community at the university, that these are the values that we would like to see in our tools, how does that translate to concrete metrics, to concrete algorithms? And there are a lot of communities in computer science that think about this question. Different communities have different terms for this. For example, socio-technical alignment is one of them in certain circles. Certainly not a solved problem.
I would just add quickly, like, I guess, focusing on imagination. And this is also why I guess I'm less concerned. I think that there's a good way to use the super duper big models. And the vision for that actually is that I don't think that people should be really I don't think we should be integrating constant calls to AI models in all of our workplace in the way that I think the sales reps for the folks doing the sales of these enterprise deals for Copilot and similar, right? There's a similar one that all the AI companies have. The salespeople have to go out and make a pitch to the university and say, hey, use this a lot, get your profs to make their lessons plans with it, get your students to make their study guides with it, tokens. And I think that's like definitely the wrong approach. And instead, the real positive vision is that we should be occasionally interfacing with the really, really, really big models to help us build the non-AI tools that we want, right? A thing that you can do now is that if you want to if you kind of flirted with cool, fun, command line, terminal, wacky setups on a Linux box when you were in college, and then you gave up with it, and now you use your work-assigned Windows computer every day. Although wait, sorry, I'm here in Europe, and you've actually some of you have escaped that. I've learned recently, but you can now go and you can spend 5 hours with the best super duper super expensive model, use a bunch of inference, and make your dream note-taking app. And that is a thing that's viable now, and that's a much more exciting vision, I think, for trying to integrate AI personalized into your digital workflow. And basically it's downstream of the fact that I don't think that most work tasks actually require you to make a massive giant query to a massive giant model every 5 minutes when you're sitting at your computer doing your white-collar work.
I don't knowingly use child or forced labor, and for that reason, I don't use generative AI systems either.
We talked about infrastructure. We talked about who is in the room and about representation. And one other practical question is, who would facilitate collective decision-making and collective governance? Are there organizations who could take on this role? For example, would DPAs have the capacity to take on such a role? Do we need new organizations? How do we go about that?
Yeah, capacity is always a good point. I don't think that we have the capacity to do this in a big way, but there are possibilities like using sandboxes, for example. That's getting to my mind in first place, because I think this might be a good playground to think about approaches like this and to think about possibilities which are perhaps a little bit different to think right now. So one from the audience said before that the individual point is so important, and yes, it is, but to take this playground, for example, in sandboxes, to think over the horizon might be a good first way.
Yeah, and there's a whole industry of democratic innovation practitioners all across Europe who do this for corporations and councils and governments and so on, day in and day out. And there's a debate in the community about these people are great, they've got really good expertise of facilitation, they know how to do it, and there's definitely a place for them. But that really as we deal with more and more kind of complex societal problems, that really we should be building this sort of capacity in-house in the public service, in the civil service, in the regulatory bodies, that there should be centres of expertise who know how to go out and bring people together and come to collective decisions and facilitate it well and build the whole infrastructure. But at the moment, there's probably 10 organizations in this city who know how to do it. And there's some in most other European cities as well.
I'll just point very briefly to some of the most obscure and hated sections of GDPR, hated because people think that they're ineffectual and a waste of time, and I'm not convinced that that's true yet, which is Articles 40 through 44. GDPR, specifically Article 41, monitoring of approved codes of conduct, where the legislator has set out the possibility for the monitoring of compliance with the code of conduct of how to implement data protection law in a particular kind of category of controllers. And the article sets out that monitoring of this code of conduct can be carried out by a body which has an appropriate level of expertise in relation to the subject matter of the code and is accredited for that purpose by the competent supervisory authority, right? And then so Article 43 is the same thing for certification bodies. So I think, you know, there's a great deal of critique of the kind of meta-regulatory approach. But I think in the universe where we're aware that data protection authorities have really limited capacity, this is a very understandable thing that the legislator has done, and I'm not aware of any evidence that indicates that we have really used this to the extent that we could.
So one final question before we all go for cocktails. Just a quick round. What should happen next so that collective governance could become a reality?
Yeah, perhaps we should take the things we have, like the first steps, 6 mentioned, for example, in a GDPR, and we should look what can we do with these methods. Is there a possible way? And I think we have examples which are working right now. So I thought about, I have to look the name. Yeah, you know, that was the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. I was thinking about the definition of Internet standards, for example. And I think we could look at, blueprints like this. We could look at the blueprints of certification, of codes of conduct, all the things we have, and then thinking in a third dimension, in a new dimension, taking new aspects with us on all sides, on technical sides, on ethical sides, and I think, taking these things into account would be a good first step.
Yeah, I think that we need to start, like there's conversations going here about what we may or may not want, but there's very few conversations out in the wider public in any country. So I think the Commission perhaps should take a lead and convene one of their panels on AI and on kind of regulatory frameworks and, you know, what actually want to see for their regulation. And then I think that those could be rolled out to the different member states and actually start a conversation among people about what principles, you know, what are the things we want to stand over. People have no idea about what's happening beyond kind of vague, you know, scare stories about, you know, so many thousand jobs lost today, or, you know, so many kids being affected here, or this or that, you know. So actually to start an evidence-based conversation across multiple countries, I think is what we need to do.
Yeah, just to say one thing, to keep it short, speaking directly on this point, I think one of the most promising avenues for trying to do this at a global level is through the lens of AI evaluation and safety, actually. So this is like the one thing that seems to be people are at least open to the idea of multinational cooperation across the traditional sort of like rivalries and power dynamics there. And I think that there's actually real potential to sort of sneak in a lot of the data agency ideas and the collective direct action via data leverage through a global framework around like auditing and verification. So that like could, you know, be another 2-hour panel, but I'm quite excited about that specifically as a real pragmatic solution that we can like do in the next couple months.
I don't know about next couple months, Nick, but there's a lot of regulatory stuff happening. You know, if you live in Europe and you work in Brussels and do policy stuff and you care about this, the most important thing to do right now is to stop this GDPR omnibus because it's full of trash and it's terrible. And why is it there? Why is it there? Why is it there? It's there because this is about eroding Europe's capability to have democratic governance because it's fucking inconvenient for Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and they're like 5 friends. So like this is about democracy, right? So like, well, wherever you are, do that, work on that. You know, if you work in Geneva and you want to come to the International Labor Conference and work on the Platform Work Convention, that's where I'll be in June. It will be really unpleasant. We'll be in a basement for 2 weeks. But like, defend democracy, defend human rights. You know, it's a shit time. But keep doing what you're doing. Thanks. Thanks for being here. Go have a cocktail. Thank you, Asha.
We're at the official end time of the session. I'm not going to add anything else because I think this is the perfect set of final words. Let's thank our panel speakers again.